First of all, AI is nowhere even close to that. Now, AI primarily right now does very specific things. It helps, just, look at mortgage applications and it does very specific. This sort of general AI that could destroy the world, we're decades away from that.
Hi everyone, I'm Petrus and welcome to WorldView. WorldView is a podcast where we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. If you've watched any of our content so far and liked it, please consider liking this video, subscribing, and donating on Patreon. Today we're talking with Dr. Paul Root Wolpe. The doctor is an American sociologist and bioethicist. He has served for 15 years as a bioethicist at NASA and written over 150 articles, editorials, book chapters in sociology, medicine, and bioethics, as well as general ethics. He co-authored the textbook Sexuality and Gender in Society and the End of Life Guide, Behoref Hayamim, in the Winter of Life. Doctor, welcome to the show.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
So I'll have to be honest with you, when I read bioethicist, I first had to Google the pronunciation thereof, and then after I Googled the pronunciation of, I looked at the definition. And I think it's something that people may underestimate in the sense that they're not exactly sure what it means. They may not have heard it before. So I'm going to read you a definition here from the Educational Commission in the US, and then you can just tell me, what is it exactly practically about? Or is that even a fair definition in terms of what you do? So they say, a bioethicist is a professional with advanced degree in one of many fields who addresses the questions about the right thing to do when there are conflicting values and uncertainty about ethically justifiable decisions or actions. Would that even be accurate, or is that not what you do at all?
No, that's not too bad, but the devil's in the details. I mean, what does that really mean? And who do we speak to, and what kind of authority, if any, do we have, are really the questions. So bioethics started out as a field in medicine primarily, and looking at ethical questions in medicine. And the history of it goes all the way back thousands of years. Ethical questions and the way in which humans interact with each other, whether they're about medicine or about our interpersonal relationships, are as ancient as human thought. But modern bioethics was a product of many dynamics of the 20th century, especially what happened in Nazi Germany and the Nuremberg trials after that tried to say, how could we have had a situation where humans experimented on other humans without consent and without any semblance of ethical structure? So out of that came many conversations around the nature of ethically based medicine. And that began to expand over time. And then in the United States, we had what we call the crisis of medicine, where costs blew out of control. So all kinds of other professions began to move into medicine, sociologists and economists and others. And what ended up coming out of that stew was a belief that a group of people who could think carefully about all of the ethical tensions around medicine, and then out of life sciences, as the genomic project started and all of that, could help guide the conversation around what turned out to be a whole series of thorny issues. And so many bioethicists are in the academy. Some are in not-for-profit organizations or world organizations like the World Health Association, others organizations. And we try to leaven the conversation around difficult issues with some insights from our particular disciplinary perspectives.
And I'm assuming it's such a difficult thing to deal because, if I just think about it practically, you have, especially as you now mentioned, a bunch of different fields that come together, and they all have a certain perspective on it. And I mean, there's definitely people from, sociology background thinking about the humane factors here, the medical background thinking about the medical implications, economic background thinking about, cost spending and how that money is spent, ethically. And have to combine all of these mentalities into one, especially in multifaceted projects. Is that something which requires a host of different people, or do you explore almost every one individually and then you try and combine these together as an individual when you try and guide these conversations?
So it's always a host of people, all contributing their perspectives, and that's how it should be. Because as you say, everyone brings a different tool to this job. And as a social scientist, I have a very different perspective. I mean, most bioethicists, or a large percentage of bioethicists, are philosophers and theologians, because traditionally ethics was a field of philosophy. But as it became clear that other kinds of perspectives were necessary, social scientists like me moved in, clinicians, as you mentioned, were always part of it in medicine. Almost all the historical documents in bioethics were written by physicians of their time. Legal scholars come in because legal issues are very closely related to ethical issues, though not the same thing as some people think. And so it's a robust conversation. When you get into biotechnologies, genetic engineering, when you get into neuroethics, the ethics of neuroscience and all of the things, the ways we're manipulating the brain, when you get into AI ethics and the complexities of artificial intelligence, then you really need neuroscientists for neuroethics, and you need AI experts for AI. Ethicists can't do this by themselves, whatever that would even mean. So they become really rich, complex conversations.
And having those conversations about right and wrong, I mean, like you've mentioned now, in the, very logical, pragmatic sense of the thing, right and wrong would be something that's defined by legal terms, but that just simply isn't the case here with so many people coming together. So trying to define right and wrong for something like bioengineering, I watched one of your presentations on that, becomes extremely difficult. So where exactly do you even put right and wrong within the spectrum of the conversation?
So here's a little truth that I've discovered for 40 years of doing this that is counterintuitive. And that is, ethics is not about right and wrong. Now, that's what we're taught from the beginning. If you say to anybody, ethics is the discussion between blank and blank, they'll all know right and wrong should go into those blanks. And it is about right and wrong at its base. When you teach children ethics, don't hit your sister, don't steal the candy. I mean, we teach right and wrong. But if you think about any ethical dilemma you've had in your life as an adult, as a thinking, complex person, when I talk to groups, whether they're physicians or business people, and I ask them to think about professional ethical dilemmas they've had, what you realize, if you think about it deeply, is something we all know, but I don't think we realize it till we hear someone say it. And that is, complex adult ethical dilemmas are never about a right versus, or very rarely about a right versus wrong. And if they are about a right versus wrong, we usually know what the right answer is. Complex ethical dilemmas are something else. So ethics is about values, and ethical dilemmas are about values in conflict. Two values in conflict. Neither value is wrong. What an adult ethical dilemma is about is two values, both of which can't be satisfied. So I've taught medical students my whole life, my whole career. And I always give them cases. That's how you teach ethics, you give cases. And a simple case might be, you think the following is in the best interest of the patient, but the patient demands that you do something else. What do you do as a doctor? Simple, right? So we call the patient's desire to do what they want autonomy. And we call the desires to do, the physician's desire to do what's in the best interest of the patient, beneficence. So what we have here is a conflict between autonomy and beneficence. They're both really good things. We want patients to have autonomy. We want doctors to approach with beneficence. Now the question is, how do we balance these two values when they can't both be satisfied? That's what an ethical dilemma is. Now notice, it's not a right or a wrong here. It's two values in conflict. And what I try to teach when I work with professionals, when I work with individuals to think through ethical dilemmas, is how do you define what the values are here? How do you decide which values are in conflict? And what ways of thinking through those conflicts might lead to a resolution that it has integrity? And that's what an ethical dilemma really is.
I just find that so absolutely fascinating, because to a certain extent we've had, especially in South Africa, we have this context where you have a lot of different backgrounds, a wonderful mixture of cultures and value systems that are vastly different. They're created across different continents and areas, and they come together and they usually clash, especially in things that are very near and dear to us in that regard. So trying to coincide these in the way that you describe it just makes absolute perfect sense, because inherently, given the background of the person, that the way they went through with their age, the way they were, the family they came from, these ethics and these values are not wrong. They're just that's what they experienced, and they're in conflict with the experience that somebody else had. Is that something you also faced? People who are just simply coming from, such different backgrounds that there wasn't any ground truths that you can necessarily agree on to be able to build the compromise on? Because I'm assuming that's what you need.
So here's the secret of that problem. I'm often asked a question that sounds something like, is there one ethic for human beings of all time, or does ethics change over time and place? There are variations of that question, but that's it boiled down to basics. And the answer is yes. Both of those are true. And how can that be possible? Well, the way that's possible is fundamental ethical categories have always been the same throughout all of human history. Questions of freedom, questions of rights, questions of duties, questions of loyalty, honesty, they've always been there. But if what I said at the beginning is true, that what ethics is conflicts between values, different ethical systems aren't because people believe different values, it's because they weigh the conflicts between values differently. And as ethics changes over time, these, take for example, individual liberty versus community good. So this is politics, right? Politics in every culture is somewhat about how much do we give individual liberty? Of course, in the United States, that's through the roof, versus community good and community responsibility, which, for example, in many Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries, are through the roof. And so it now becomes, now, it isn't that those Southeast Asian countries don't believe in individual liberty, and it isn't that the United States, for example, doesn't believe in community good. It is just when individual liberty and community good are in conflict, which one wins out. So when you talk about people from different backgrounds in conflict, the problem is that there isn't enough of a recognition at the beginning that we're talking about the same values. Because what ends up happening is people end up defending the value that they think wins in that conflict of values without acknowledging and recognizing the value of the importance of the other value. And so people talk past each other. But if you can have what I call a value-mediated conversation, there's a conversation where someone who understands this dynamic, and I think good mediators understand this intuitively, even if they've never articulated it like this, then you can get each side to recognize that they themselves share the value that the other side is trying to promote. They just think that their value that they're promoting is superior or more important or will solve a problem in this situation. Once you get both sides accepting that they actually agree on the value set with the other side, they just weigh it differently, it's a very different conversation than if I think my values are different than your values.
And I mean, I've seen this happen so many times. It's actually kind of funny. It's, you have these two people that are in absolute fervent, argument with each other. They're in debate. And then after a while, you as a third person, because you're, outside of that conversation, you're realizing, but wait, they're arguing for exactly the same thing. They don't realize the common goal to which they're working towards. And then once that common goal is recognized, like you said, the conversation is just completely different. And one that's usually mostly more constructive. It's about compromise. It's not about, clashing of ideologies and groupings that do differentiate people into, but rather in terms of like what's the practical steps in terms of making these type of value systems coincide within a society which we all can live. Exactly. And I want to talk about, I want to talk about some of the work that you've done. We mentioned here that you were a bioethicist for NASA for 15 years. Yes. And I know from, watching some of your talks and hearing you talk, you've gone over a bunch of different fields from bioengineering to AI ethics to neuro ethics. How exactly do you coincide the work that you did at NASA? Where was the orientation there in comparison to these fields? And what was some of the advice that you gave, answers that you questions that you answered, and advice that you gave to help solve these issues?
So at NASA, I was functioning as a bioethicist. So I run at Emory University, where I'm from, I run a center for ethics. So it includes bioethics, medicine and life science, and then it also includes many things, many ethical problems outside of medicine and life science. NASA has questions and issues and ethical dilemmas outside of life science and medicine, but my job at NASA was to be an advisor to the Chief Health and Medical Office and the Chief Health and Medical Officer, and it was entirely about bioethical issues. So I wanted to make that clear first. And NASA has a lot of bioethical challenges, and some of them are just about running a big giant agency with 90,000 at the time human beings. But the ones that everyone are interested in, of course, are the ones having to do with space and astronauts, which actually was just one part of what I did with them, but that's what everyone's interested in. And there are a lot of interesting bioethical issues around space travel. We take some of the healthiest people in the world and we put them in an environment that makes them sick. Being in space is a very hostile environment. Our bodies are not designed to be in zero gravity and what we call microgravity. You lose muscle mass, you lose bone density. There's fluid loading in the upper part of the body because your body isn't fighting gravity, your blood isn't fighting gravity, and our bodies are designed to pump our blood up against gravity, but if there's no gravity there, it just starts pumping all our fluids up and you get, and that has interesting results. So for example, astronauts are rarely thirsty because their brain is seeing all this fluid that it thinks means that you're really well hydrated, when actually it's because all of this fluid is being pumped up to the upper part of the body. It's very difficult to sleep in space. We don't recognize how much of our sleeping is what we call nestling in. Gravity helps us have that sense. You don't have that in space. And people in space get injured a lot. There's stuff floating around. There are bungee cords on everything. So there's a lot of medical issues in space. In addition, things like taking drugs. Our metabolism is different in space. So drugs they take affects the human body differently. So there are all of those kinds of questions. How do we equip a craft? You know, if you're just going up to space station, it's one thing, but if we go to the moon and Mars, what medical equipment do we put on that craft? What formulary, what drugs do we put on that craft? We can't put the entire human known drug, formulary on there. It's no room. You have to make decisions on what kinds of things are likely to happen, how severe they would be if they do happen, what kinds of good countermeasures do we have? So there are all of those kinds of questions. There are questions, I'll just give you a couple more examples. So you're an astronaut, you're halfway to Mars, and someone in your family dies or gets diagnosed with cancer, or 9/11 happens in the United States. What do we tell you and what don't we tell you? What do you need to know and what don't you need to know, or what should you know, or what shouldn't you know? You're on spacecraft and you get sick halfway to Mars. When do we abort the mission and bring you back, or do we just say, sorry, you're gonna, you're so sick and we could fix you here, but we can't fix you there, you're gonna die because we can't abort a mission? Those are all the kinds of decisions over and over again that NASA is going to have to make, already makes on space station. And I tried to help them think those kinds of questions through.
And I mean, there's so many actually cool explorations of these type of questions that we see in popular media. In some of it documentary, some of it fictional. I know that Russia just brought back a director and an actress who shot a movie about a doctor which had to go up to the International Space Station and then perform surgery because the astronaut wasn't healthy enough to come back. So that'll actually explore some of these questions that you've now mentioned. And I don't know if you've recently seen perhaps the documentary about the 4 civilians that went up on the SpaceX mission. But there were also some medical questions there, and the one thing I really enjoyed about that series is the way in which they explored the family's experience, and especially the workers at SpaceX and the impact on their lives. And I'd actually like to flip this around, and I know people are interested about the astronauts, but you mentioned that you also gave advice to people that are working at NASA. There's a harsh impact on the individuals that work at NASA that ask these astronauts, these individuals, to go into an environment which will damage them physically. You're asking them to do that. And yes, they say, yeah, but I mean, you're the one that's asking them, you're the one that's preparing them for that. So what's the impact on the individual that stays in the ground, the family and the workers?
Yeah. So to start with what you said about SpaceX, NASA is a very different place than SpaceX because NASA is a quasi-governmental agency. It answers to Congress. It's enormous. And so it was very sensitive to certain kinds of issues that a private company is less sensitive to. So my experience at NASA was very interesting that way. They were extraordinarily careful about these kinds of issues. But your question is a really good one, because everyone at NASA who at least works with astronauts understand NASA is an enormous agency, and only a small subgroup of them actually work with astronauts. There are hundreds of engineers that just build ships, and then it's the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. There's a whole part of NASA that just works on jet engines and things that have nothing to do with space at all. But the people who do work on space, the moment that I really saw the power of that was after the Columbia disaster. When those astronauts were killed, this was an agency in utter mourning. People were weeping. They had personal relationships with these people. They saw them for weeks, months, in some cases years. They worked with them, whether they were training them or fitting them for their spacesuit or talking to them about their, retirement plan. It doesn't matter. They were people, lots of people in lots of different places at this agency had personal relationships with these individuals who were killed. So you're right. There are impacts far beyond the individuals, and the families are another question. And as an ethicist, part of the question you want to ask is, what kinds of information do we give families versus individuals, and what kinds of questions do we ask? And let's say, for example, and you were an administrator at NASA or SpaceX or someplace, and I was the astronaut, and I said, I'm going, this is great. And then you discover that my entire family is dead set against it. They don't want me to go. I mean, what do we do? How do we even think about that? Do I, as an individual astronaut, have the right to do what I want? And do you, as an agency, have any responsibility whatsoever to my family? Or is that just a conduit through me? Those are the kinds of questions we must answer. And we must, imagine an astronaut going on a 3-year mission to Mars. So the questions, you're absolutely right, go beyond the individuals to their entire networks of relations. And by the way, that's not just true of NASA. When we do medical ethics, we have to ask similar kinds of questions. Do we only have an ethical responsibility to the patient? Or is there also some ethical responsibility that extends to the patient's family or other significant people in their lives?
Those must be incredibly difficult questions to answer. I'm honestly just imagining it. I think of some of the challenges you face there. It has to be astronomical. And I'm assuming, I know you have experience in AI ethics as well, but assuming there's a bit of a contrast in terms of dealing with these very real, the people, the impact, you see the families, to something which at this point for a largest part of the population, of Earth, is still theoretical. It's like, do you think it's even possible? Do people even think it's possible for a program and AI to stop us or to wipe us out? Is it even possible for us to fight against that? I know there was a talk that Sam Harris, he said the danger of AI is that it might not consider us useful anymore. Given the whatever directive it's given, it's like, okay, we're kind of getting in the way. Especially a holistic, positive one. Like, okay, make sure that we're stopping destroying all the species on Earth. Something nice like that. And then it's like, okay, well, the humans are a problem. Get that one, nip that one in the bud. Is it possible for us to stop it? So, what do you think about that?
A few things about that. First of all, what's interesting is I was a big science fiction reader in high school when I was growing up. And all of these questions have been asked in science fiction, at least for decades. And they're all scenarios that we've woven in literature to try to answer them. The question of AI destroying humanity is a question way down the line, and we can all think about it theoretically. And it makes a lot of assumptions that we don't even know are true, that AI will ever have that power, that AI will be self-aware enough to make that decision, that so all of those things may or may not be true. And I talk about, by the way, those kinds of questions, and we have a fun time with them. And there is a whole field of AI that looks at the question of how we get AI to think about human beings once it gets to the point that it's thinking about human beings. Few things to say about that. First of all, AI is nowhere even close to that. Now, AI primarily right now does very specific things. It helps, just, look at mortgage applications and it does very specific. This sort of general AI that could destroy the world, we're decades away from that. And AI builds incrementally. That is, we build AI from AI is made up of algorithms, and these are algorithms built on algorithms. And humans make the algorithms. At least for now, there is a possibility of AI building its own algorithms. Some AIs can already build simple algorithms. So we can build in protections of whatever kind we want. When we talk about AI ethics these days, though that is a part of it, that's not really what we're dealing with. AI ethics at this level asks questions like, how do we protect people's privacy when AI is this enormous consumer of data and all of our personal information is in that data? How do we prevent biases? Because the data that AI uses to generate its decisions is data that human beings have created, and it is always biased because humans cannot create unbiased data. How do we think about AI and job displacement? Because AI is already threatening to replace many, many different kinds of jobs, whether we're talking about automated cars replacing drivers, or whether we're talking about sophisticated algorithms able to read x-rays, sometimes better than radiologists can. So white collar, blue collar, I mean, across the board, AI can already read contracts, and in fact, catches problems in contracts often better than human readers do. So we're not just talking about, usually when we talk about technology replacing people, we're talking about laborers and things like that. But AI, it's across the board. We're talking about AI replacing skilled labor and even educated labor that depends on high education. Those are the kinds of questions that we're asking around AI these days. It's fun to talk about AI 50 years from now taking over the world, but we have some actual important, really difficult AI questions right now. AI is everywhere. It's ubiquitous. Every single person listening to this uses AI every day in their GPS, in their smartphones, when they make phone calls into companies, and especially whenever they go on the web and buy something or go onto a website where it's all around us. And it has powers over us that are not obvious, that people don't see that easily. And that raises all kinds of ethical challenges.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to unpack with this that I think is absolutely fascinating for people to talk about. Perhaps because it is, like you said, still a couple of years out, it's still fascinating for us to talk about. Maybe when this is, a humanitarian crisis, we'll be less happy about it, of course. But, one of the first thing I wanted to ask about was when you mentioned at the start, you, as a reader of sci-fi, have read a lot of stories, and there are a ton of stories that deal with this problem. I mean, I'm just thinking about, the common ones that have so many instances of AI that deal with it, the sci-fi TV shows all the way from Star Trek to Stargate, all these different ones, they explore these issues. Is it kind of fun as a bioethicist to be able to have this fictional, almost a testing ground where people can make some assumptions because they don't know what's going to happen. So they can make some assumptions that are going to happen, and then they can try to play the story out with characters that they create. And you're almost having this as a kind of a, preemptive case study, no matter how unrealistic it is, to explore.
I'll go even deeper than that. So you're absolutely right. And there are courses that have been taught by colleagues of mine, and I've taught courses. Ethics in Star Trek is a course. It's been taught. But we have a program at my ethics center called Ethics in the Arts. And in it, we use theater, movies, all kinds of things. There is no, I'm going to make a kind of bold statement. There are no plays and there are no movies that don't have an ethical dilemma as part of what generates the interest and tension of them. And that's what makes them interesting, is some ethical problem. Even shoot 'em ups, even slapstick comedy has some ethical problem. Even Charlie Chaplin eating that shoe leather is about poverty and hunger and, our responsibility. You can get ethical questions generated out of almost any good art. And I would go further and say even visual arts are often, it's a little more difficult, but even there, you can pull ethical dilemmas out of it. So we have a whole program at my center called Ethics and the Arts, where we use art as a vehicle to discuss ethical problems. So yes, you're absolutely right. Artists have spent time throughout history asking those kinds of questions. Many of the great pieces of art in history pose some ethical dilemma within them as part of what makes them interesting as artistic pieces.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that, because I'm obviously not within that environment. It's not my area of study, so I didn't know that was happening. But it's really cool to hear that it is happening, and it's so useful, because you think it'd be a cool idea and realize, no, wait, this is already being done. This is already being explored. So that's really cool to hear.
When you and your friends leave a movie, you sit in the car driving home afterwards or having a beer, discussing the ethical. You don't think of it as discussing the ethical dilemma, but I, as an ethicist, bring my lens to it. It's remarkable how much of that conversation is around what someone should have done or shouldn't have done, and whether this was right or that was right, or how could they have done this. Ethics is part of how we think about these kinds of experiences.
And they're fun. Like, people really enjoy having these conversations, and having a fun environment like a movie or a book to discuss and explore, and then having a fun discussion after it is what tickles us intellectually, and it makes us excited.
Totally.
And I want to kind of segue this a bit into the other question I had about your original answer to the stopping AI as a program. That you mentioned there that there was AI is often trained by human-generated data sets. And within our data sets, like you said, it's impossible to not have a bias. I've seen suggestions and articles that say, it's impossible for us to have a form of government that'll actually benefit both the individuality and the community to the best possible compromise, because we are biased. You have an individual bias. So we should generate a general AI which could kind of find this bias between the two. And I want to know what your reaction is on that, because like you said, the AI is generated by the bias. So would it then also have a bias and therefore not be practical? Or is there a way in which we can use a kind of a third party that doesn't have this human factor to try and make either as many people happy or stand out, the balance between individual freedom and community?
It's a wonderful question, and we don't know the answer, but I'll tell you what I think. And that is, I can't imagine a more frightening proposition than asking artificial intelligence to make human-based decisions for 2 or 3 reasons. First of all, our assumption is that compromise that you're speaking about is possible. We just can't do it because we're too biased. But it may be the nature of human life that it's not possible intrinsically. And if that's true, then asking AI to do it is just asking for trouble. The second thing is, there is a problem that's going to be part of AI for the foreseeable future. I can't speak for 100 years from now. Who knows what life will look like? But there are many assumptions that we make about life that we don't make explicit. So AI doesn't have any of those assumptions, and we can't remember or guess or anticipate what all of them are. And this has been shown again and again in AI in really obvious and blatant ways. There was a case of a group of students who were supposed to create a tic-tac-toe algorithm, simple, just an exercise. And of course, if you create a good tic-tac-toe algorithm, then when we put my algorithm against your algorithm, it should be a draw every single time. Because if you want to create a draw, you can always create a draw. So all of a sudden, one of these algorithms began winning every game. And they said, how is this possible? So they went into the system to look at what happened. And this is what the algorithm did. It learned how to turn off the other algorithm. So it would go in, turn off the other algorithm. That algorithm would forfeit. It would turn it back on. Then they would start a new game. It would turn it off. That algorithm would forfeit. It would turn it back on. And it just did this endlessly. So it won every game. Now, if I said to you, Beatrice, let's play tic-tac-toe. We sat down and I punched your lights out. And when you woke up, I said, well, you lost the first game. Let's start the second one. And I punched your lights out. I mean, you'd say, what is wrong with you? Because you and I know what the rules are. That algorithm didn't know what the rules were. It only knew the rules that it was told. So it took this thing that none of us would ever think is legitimate or could do, but it did exactly what it was told to do: win every game. That's what it was told to do. Try to win every game. So what are all of these little assumptions that you and I take for granted? You know, you and I right now are talking, we're listening to each other, we're nodding to encourage the other person. I wait for your question. I mean, there are 1,000 rules about how to have a conversation, and algorithms aren't going to know any of those rules unless they're given each one explicitly. But we learn them not through explicit telling, but by modeling. We learn by watching other people. So a very worrisome part of AI is, what is it that AI doesn't know? You know, if you tell AI cure cancer, there's an easy way to cure cancer: kill everybody with cancer, right? And then cancer is eliminated, right? It's questions like that, but not in those, of course, blatant ways. Those are the things we know to tell AI. It's little things. So that, you know, that is a bigger problem to me than AI eventually, maybe someday, destroying all of us. Um, it's going to take a long, long time before AI can interact with us in ways that has that kind of subtlety.
And it's actually, I find that really interesting because if you think about it, you're going to try and create something which, without having any previous knowledge about the issue that it's addressing, or the problem it's trying to solve, just as we as humans do, will then try and find a solution, because we also very rarely always know the answer to what we're going to do, or always have seen this context before. So we have to generate something from the previous experiences that we had. And at the end of the day, we're still just going to, if we do create an AI that's perfectly able to do that in a way that doesn't terrify us, it's probably going to be just as biased or developed as a human. So we would just have created another human instead of the ideal sense where we create something which could think clearer than a human in that regard. So it kind of, in that regard, I mean, I don't know if this is a crazy claim that I'm making, but it's kind of like a pointless effort in that regard to try and create an AI which can solve the way that we think biased.
So yes and no. I mean, if AI can do things we can't do. So AI can read and understand millions and millions and millions, and even trillions of words and documents in a way we can't. It can put together information that we can't. It can understand things that we can't. And so the question becomes, what happens when AI gets to the level of understanding that surpasses ours? Does it then come to us with some kind of wisdom that we don't have? Or does it then become something other and alien, and now in some sense not human, and not really getting what makes living as a human being important and valuable? Now, understand, there's a whole group of people in this world who look forward to the age of spiritual machines, that thinks that the next step in evolution on this planet will be the elimination of we carbon-based life forms, and in favor of, that's the matrix in some sense, right? I mean, this idea that machines will replace human beings as the next step in understanding. There will be far more, they'll be able to understand far more than we can understand. But for most of us who don't believe that is true, that the purpose of machines at best is to be, aids and servants to the human endeavor, and at worst to be partners in some sense, perhaps someday gaining some kind of sentience, which also, of course, is explored all the time in science fiction, whether you're looking at Star Trek or Star Wars. Okay, they both all have sentient robot companions or android companions of some kind. All of this is going to happen. This isn't science fiction anymore, and it isn't a pipe dream. I mean, it is remarkable how quickly artificial intelligence is already progressing. It's only been around for a blink of an eye in historic time. I mean, a decade really of really good, sophisticated AI, maybe a little bit further, depending on how far back you want to go. And we're talking about endless humanity and ahead of us, with presumably machines getting better and better and better and better. I don't know where the endpoint of that is, or if there is an endpoint. Some people think there isn't. So the evolution of humans and their machines and their artificial intelligence is just beginning. And I don't think any of us know what that endpoint's going to look like.
It's a fascinating thing to talk about. I mean, we unpacked this a bit more than I necessarily were planning to, but I think it's such a fascinating discussion. You can kind of have it all day. Because of that, I would just like to quickly pivot us away because other things, otherwise I think we can go on for quite a while. I just want to pivot over to another thing which you're very experienced and I've done a lot of talks about, which is bioengineering. And this is something that people, perhaps if you just have a bunch of laymen around a fire and you're just talking about it, having a barbecue, you might think that bioengineering is something that people feel is a more immediate problem or question that we're dealing with. And I think it's mainly because people don't really know what's going on that they think it's an immediate solution. Or is it actually an immediate solution? That's actually the question that I want to ask is, can you give us an idea of how capable we are as a species today in terms of bioengineering?
So that's a great question. And in some ways, what was interesting was to see the Human Genome Project and other things develop, and people care about this. And as other things actually passed it, like AI, we didn't realize, or it was hard for people to realize, that there were other more pressing questions. So yes, especially with the advent of CRISPR and really new sophisticated bioengineering technologies, we are able to do things. I like to say the average middle school student, the average 12-year-old in their biology class can do things that the greatest scientists in the world couldn't do 25 years ago. And that's literally true. Yet we have safeguards in place. There is no area of scientific life more careful, maybe nuclear energy, but more carefully guarded and thought about, and the ethics of it and the safety of it more concern than bioengineering. And that has been true up till now, but it won't be true moving into the future. And what do I mean by that? It's been true up till now because almost all of those technologies could be done primarily in sophisticated laboratories, in academic institutions, in big companies. But what these new technologies mean is that a really good graduate student, if he or she had the equipment, could do things in their garage that have the potential to harm us, to create a new form of bacterium that's pathogen, that something can make us sick, or a new toxin that could get out into the environment and cause environmental damage. That's really where I think the danger lies, not so much in what's happening, at university labs, but the fact that these technologies are becoming much, much easier for much less sophisticated people to use, or bioterrorism, right, which may become actually a much easier way to attack than using conventional weapons. So these are the places where I think biotechnology becomes problematic and interesting, in a scary way. That being said, it's also true that the question of what even sophisticated laboratories should do is also part of this. Where are the lines drawn? The good news is that up until now, and even now, and in the at least short-term foreseeable future, almost all countries and almost all responsible parties have agreed not to use this on human beings, that manipulating, we can do it now. I mean, we could genetically engineer the human organism in certain ways. But all of us have agreed, all of the people who think about this in a sophisticated way, that that's not something that should be done. A few years ago, some people may have heard that a Chinese scientist did intervene in the genomes of a pair of twins that were born there, presumably, or at least ostensibly, to try to prevent AIDS transmission. He was roundly condemned. He was condemned by China. He was condemned by the United States. That kind of universal agreement that we shouldn't be doing that is a very rare thing in international relations. But the fact that everyone agrees on this, all the countries that do this agree on this, should be very heartening to people. It shows that For now, at least, this is all contained. I think the worry is as we move forward, as these things become much more accessible, that there will be people without that level of ethical scrutiny doing these things.
I just had the thought, and please correct me if I'm going off completely the wrong tangent here. But as you mentioned, nuclear engineering is perhaps the one area which is more deliberated in terms of ethics than perhaps bioengineering. But I try and, in my layman's mind, try and find the parallels between these two as you were speaking, and it felt a bit eerily, scarily accurate or similar, in the sense that perhaps the nuclear story over the past, what's it been now, 70 years? Yeah, about 70, 75 years. The nuclear story has been almost a success story with regards to the managing of it and the fact that we haven't, had a full-blown nuclear war in that regard. And it's been because of also universal condemnation. But, in the same way, and this is what I would like to have your insight about, it's also been a bit of an arms race. Like, yes, everybody condemns it, but it doesn't stop someone due to the accessibility of being able to do it, whether that's intentional or not in the case of, being so accessible or just bioterrorism in its origin.
Yeah.
So do you think that there's an equal success story that could be happening here if you relate to those two topics?
I think, yes, there is a parallel, but I think there's one very, very important major difference. And that is, to really build a nuclear weapon, you need a country. To do genetic engineering, you need one person in a laboratory. And so controlling what countries do is much easier than controlling what hundreds of thousands or millions of individuals do. Also, in the United States, we have a pretty well-defined and well set up system of oversight, but in other countries they don't, in terms of what individuals might be doing, or even laboratories might be doing, or private companies might be doing. By the way, private companies do not have nearly the oversight on these issues that, for example, universities have. The disaster, if there is one, is probably not going to come out of the universities. It probably won't even come out of the major companies. It'll probably come out of some mid-size or small company trying to do something and not having the sophistication to control it properly, or the oversight, or some set of malevolent individuals who are really trying to cause the kind of harm that they end up causing. That's where I think the real danger lies.
And I mean, that's almost I want to say almost too terrifying idea for some people to have, because they definitely, they'll immediately think like, okay, but maybe small companies shouldn't be allowed near this technology. It's like, okay, how do we police this? It becomes a practical question of how one deals with this type of scenario, and it almost becomes like an impossible question to answer, in the sense that you say it's just becoming more and more accessible. So I can imagine people being afraid of it.
You can't control it. You can't. I mean, unlike nuclear, the way we control nuclear arms is we control plutonium, because it's not like you can just go out and get it at the corner store. But the kinds of things that you need to do, the emerging biotechnology, the emerging genetic engineering, are readily accessible. And you don't need country level influence to get these materials. You can get them, anybody can get them who knows how to get them. So it becomes a lot more accessible, and that way a lot harder to control.
Yeah, but before I go over to our last questions, because we're reaching the end here, I want to ask one more spin-off question. In the same way as we had with AI, all these fun type of sci-fi explorations of AI, we've also had sci-fi explorations of modifications of the human body, be that by bioengineering or by CRISPR or genetic engineering. So bioengineering or genetic engineering, especially with themes that are quite popular today, like cyberpunk and those as well. In that regard, do you feel like that's something that regulation or rules governing adding parts to the human body will be able to prevent in a large degree? Since I'm assuming that's a bit more difficult than creating a virus, is creating an industry where that can thrive.
So that's a great question, an interesting one, because we let people modify their bodies in extraordinary ways. I mean, we've all seen people who have, split their tongues, created, body modifications in very extreme ways, put prosthetics under their skin to create bumps and horns and, sharpen their teeth and all. So we let people tattoo their bodies from head to toe. Where do we begin to draw the line about an adult modifying themselves is an interesting question. The thing about genetic engineering that becomes deeply problematic is right now genetic engineering happens at the embryonic stage. So it's not about you or I using genetic engineering to modify ourselves, which one might claim that's my right as an adult. It's about whether I can genetically engineer my offspring. And that's much, much more ethically problematic because I am imposing on another human being a bodily modification that may be atypical intentionally, that may make their life less, pleasant and desirable. But we, what is our ethical obligation there? We already have that kind of argument going on over things like male and female circumcision, where we say you shouldn't be modifying a body, or it's perfectly okay to modify a body because of the long history of doing that in this particular religion or whatever. So we have that kind of argument going on. We influence our children and change our children in many, many, many different ways just by bringing them up. And what if we start not with, wanting to have a kid with a split tongue, but what if we start with the fact that I find out that my offspring has a gene for a disease? Is it okay to genetically modify that child? And then how far do we go in that spectrum? What if we discover that there are certain genes that makes one more susceptible to alcoholism or obesity? Do I get to modify that gene? What if I live in a Muslim country where they're not drinking alcohol, or Mormon, where they're not, and so, and who cares, obesity genes or genes that bring someone more likely to become obese aren't even relevant in a subsistence level society where they don't have enough, excess nutrients to become obese. So we have all kinds of questions. What if there's a gene? What if it turns out that there actually is a gene for something like homosexuality? Right? There are some parts of the world where they're going to want to modify that gene, and other parts of the world where they're going to think that's a fundamental human violation of rights. So these are questions that are much more important right now, or possible right now, than questions of you or I genetically modifying our body, which really doesn't. There are certain ways we can, but it really isn't the same level of modification that we can do with developing organisms.
Oh, man, there's so much to unpack. There's so many questions to ask that I really want to get into. Perhaps there's a chance in the future we could delve into this further. But I just want to ask a last very, very important question, sure. Which I mentioned from the introduction. Can you tell us about your book, Behoref Hayamim, In the Winter of Life? What medical advice can you give families at the end of their life? I think this is an important one to answer before we end off.
So that book looks at the end of life issues from a Jewish perspective. It's particularly from a religious tradition, there are many books looking at it from religious traditions, but all of those books, from whatever religious tradition they are, have wisdom for the other traditions. And in this particular book, we look at everything from how do you give and receive bad news, because this book is not just for individuals going through this, it's also for healthcare professionals whose job it is to go through this. What do we think about things like euthanasia and end of life? Another very controversial set of questions. What's a family's obligation surrounding loved ones? In the United States, we talk a lot about rights. What are my rights? What are your rights? Let's defend rights. In religious traditions, not just Judaism, by the way, but that's the tradition I know the best, there's virtually no discussion of rights. There is no word for rights in the Hebrew Bible. We discuss obligations. That's what religion is about. And so the question isn't the question I often deal with as a bioethicist in the United States: what is this person's rights in dying? Who has the right to this? In Judaism, we ask the question: what are my obligations to the dying person? And what are your obligations as a dying person? So it's a different framing of the question. And what are the obligations of the family to support and help a person through the dying process? Those are the kinds of questions that we look at and ask in that volume.
I think this is amazing. I mean, we'll definitely leave the subscription, the links in the description below for people to be able to find this book. But I think it perfectly ties our discussion, from the end back to the start, and thinking about there's different value systems and different things that people talk about. And especially when we're talking about right and wrong and rights and obligations, there's a balance between these two in the way that people think about things. So I think it's important to, even if people are not from a Jewish background, to explore these options and think about this way of thinking and be able to broaden their own way of looking at right and wrong and our personal responsibilities, as we like to claim we have in the West quite strongly. So I just want to say thank you so much for trading for us. Is there anything else last you wanted to add or plug or something? Just whatever you like.
I mean, I just want to echo what you just said. I mean, I think too often in the West, we do think in terms of rights, which is an oppositional kinds of things. What is my right versus what you think I should do, or what some external thing. But, we would live in a slightly better world if people spent more time thinking about what are my obligations to others, because it's so easy to get fragmented in the world we live in today.
And I mean, we already have a word for this in the West. It's called responsibility. We have a responsibility to the others, and the responsibility that we get from our rights as well. So, it's a good focus there as well. I think it's wonderful to look at. So thank you so much, Doctor, for talking to us. I really found it absolutely fascinating. I hope we have another opportunity to talk to you again. But for those that made it thus far, if you believe in the perspective that the doctor here presented forward, or any of the discussions you found really, really interesting, please go ahead and share this video with your friends and family. Of course, it helps spread the message, spread the the discussion that we're trying to have, the world perspectives, and of course helps us also out as a YouTube channel, which we would really appreciate. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much, Doctor, for joining us. This has been WorldView.